Hey, Demand-Driven Material Requirements Planning, or DDMRP, is a multi-echelon planning and execution method. The technique works by strategically placed decoupling points or stock buffers, and has previously been described as being designed for people, not for perfection. Today on LokadTV, we're going to understand about if this method actually works in practice by looking at the 4 big innovations. So Johannes, we kind of touched upon it in the introduction there, but what's the big idea behind DDMRP?
The big idea is that you start from, I would say, the very, very classic MRP perspective, where it all boils down to the analysis of a graph of dependencies. So just to clarify for people who are listening, it's you want to build something, your finished good. Let's think, I don't know, a car. Then you need parts, but actually the parts that you need for a car are themselves assemblies that also need parts of their own. So you have like a whole hierarchy of my car need an air conditioning unit, but the air conditioning unit, it need a pump, a valve, and whatnot, and whatnot. And so the idea is that when you think of a product and you think of all the parts that it needs, it's basically a graph, a mathematical graph. You can think of it, a bit as a subway map, but with edges. So you have your graph, and basically that's a graph that starts with the finished product at the top and then explodes to the subcomponent, and then every component has sub-subcomponents and extra recursively. And if you have a very complex product, you can have a very complex graph that represents all the parts down to the very basic materials. So the MRP, the manufacturing resource planning software, what it does is that first, it just represents this information. So you can have this graph of dependencies that are represented. And then it does a series of calculations to help you produce and execute all those requirements to end up with the finished goods. And typically, it doesn't do such a good job at making many of those calculations. And DDMRP provides a series of recipes to kind of make it work better.
So how does it actually work in practice then? Would you say it's probably somewhat of an oversimplification?
So, for the first innovation that they claim is those decoupling lead time. We have to realize that they start, what is their baseline for improvement? Their baseline are, I would say, nonsensical numerical recipes, like things that are incredibly naive from a numerical optimization perspective. Your baseline is very, very poor. So indeed, when you say, does it improve on this baseline? I would say, yes. I'm pretty convinced that if you choose, but that's another problem, if you choose those decoupling points right, you will improve compared to a fairly absurd baseline. Yes, nice job. So now you're less dysfunctional. But it doesn't mean that it's anywhere close to what you could get with actual modern numerical methods. And they say, how are we going to deal with that? Well, we are going to introduce a hierarchical attribute in the graph, which are those decoupling points. So we say that instead of having just every node is just like any other node, we decide that we have the first class citizens, the points of decoupling, and the second class citizens where we don't decouple. And we are going, that's the key idea of those decoupled lead time, is that we say at every point that is decoupled, this point, which is actually a part or a component, is going to have inventory. And thus, you can assume that this thing is always available, which means that instead of taking the longest path for manufacturing, you say I take the longest path to manufacturing until I hit one of those decoupling points. That's the recipe. But again, I would say this is a recipe, numerical recipe, where you end up with a way to compute a lead time. But my first criticism maybe for those decoupling lead time thing is that, yes, when you introduce those decoupling points, yes, you do end up with a lead time that is numerically much lower. Fair. But your supply chain as a whole still have a lot more inertia. So you see, you've gamed the way you compute the lead time by introducing those decoupling things, but the inertia still exists way beyond what you say. So that's how they end up with saying, well, we introduce decoupling, strategic decoupling points, and we can reduce the lead times from 80%. Yes, numerically speaking, you end up with what you call a lead time is now much shorter. But the reality is that you have not reduced the inertia that you have in your overall network by a factor that is as large as what you have with those decoupled lead times. So there is a semantic problem here, and I will maybe get to that, to the consequence.
So let's move on to the second point of innovation in DDMRP. It's the net flow equation, and it's basically a way of maintaining those buffer points. So using things like pre-orders, things that we already know that's going to happen. So how well does this actually work in practice? It seems to make a bit of sense, really.
So the net flow equation is literally an equation that is like incredibly simplistic. It's stock on hand plus stock on order minus already guaranteed demand, what they call qualified demand. So demand that is kind of sure, a sure thing. Okay, so what you have with that is the stock that remained available to serve the uncertain demand. And good, and indeed, so the net flow equation gives you basically the amount of stock that you have to cover things that are not already a pure matter of execution because you already know that it's coming with like almost no uncertainty. And indeed, I think DDMRP is correct to distinguish in a way that are very separate things that are already known from the unknown. Because indeed, if you have a complex manufacturing process and you're maybe serving other industrial clients, the client can tell you, in 2 months from now, I want 1,000 units to be delivered at this date. And you have time to do that. So you have, at this point, to execute this delivery, there is no forecast involved. You know, it's like 2 months from now, if your lead times are less than 2 months in total, then basically it's a pure matter of execution, zero uncertainty involved. I mean, not exactly zero, people can still cancel their orders and whatnot, but let's say it's fairly safe. It's very, very different from maybe 2 months from now, there will be a client that show up and that actually asks for 1,000 units. So I believe the DDMRP is completely correct in saying that you should not try to have this kind of super naive approach, which is to forecast everything, including what you already know. And again, most of the super simplistic, the question is, why are they even stating that? Well, it's because most of EMRPs and many early implementations were doing incredibly naive things. And we're saying, well, we are just going to take the easy path, which is kind of the dumb path. We say, well, we are going to forecast the demand, all of it, including the portion that is guaranteed already. But it's very, very dumb because then you're trying to guess the future that you already know. And guess what? It's very, very hard to forecast. So if you know something about the future, you should not even try to use statistics to discover that you already know it.
Okay, if we move on to the third key innovation, this so-called decoupled explosion, sounds really, really dramatic. I mean, what's going on here?
So this is another consequence of introducing, two types of nodes in your graph of requirements. So remember, we introduced like master nodes in the graph that are those points of decoupling, which are the points which stops the lead time propagation in the calculation, not in reality, but in the calculation, and that are the points where you will want to ensure some degree of inventory. And what they say is that instead of having the bill of material, the classic way that propagates from node to node directly by saying, okay, I take the bill of material and I propagate to my children, to the things that I need, or my parents rather, my parents, the subcomponents that I need to build the finished good. I'm saying that basically when they say decoupled explosion, they say that the bill of material, we are going to just completely skip all the second-class citizen nodes to directly jump to the decoupling points. So in a way, again, it's a graph simplification technique. I mean, it's based on this hierarchy in the graph that was introduced with first-class citizen node, second-class citizen node.
And who's actually choosing those first-class and second-class citizens? If you're looking at something like an aeroplane, it's got millions of different levels to it. I mean, who's actually making those choices?
Supply chain practitioners, which is also, for me, a big cause of concern, because basically, yes, you can manually introduce a hierarchy in a graph to kind of mitigate mitigates the nonsensical consequences of very simplistic numerical recipes. So yes, that will kind of work. But indeed, you end up with supply chain practitioners who need to manually introduce those decoupling points. And guess what? It's not necessarily stable. What is like a good choice for those decoupling points is not an invariant forever in your supply chain. Why? Because if there is a part that you decide to externalize, to buy from a supplier or to buy from a supplier that is closer or on the contrary, much more distant extra, you can change quite profoundly what is happening around whatever depends on this part in your supply chain network. So your decoupling points should technically, even if it kind of worked to introduce this hierarchy in the graph, there is no reason to think that it's stationary and that you can choose them once and that it will be like good forever. So my perspective is this should be something done completely automatically. Here we are talking of a numerical recipes, and we say we have a dysfunctional numerical recipes, and we say with a lot of human insights and tweak, we can have the numerical recipe that is a little bit better.
Okay, so basically when humans get involved, we always manage to screw things up somehow.
Yes, but also it's not making such a good use of the time of those practitioners. I mean, as you were describing, if you have a complex product with thousands of parts, why do you want to invest, potentially hundreds, if not thousands of man hours of your supply chain experts to manually select those decoupling points? You could say, oh, they have such incredible insights, etc. But the reality is that it's very noisy, thousands of parts. Market conditions are changing kind of all the time, not necessarily radically, but at least changing a bit all the time. So you will need to refresh that. It's profoundly something that should be done by the machine. There is no added value. It's a pure case of numerical optimization.
Okay, let's move on to the final innovation here, which is relative priority. It's basically all about ranking in terms of a targeted stock quantity. Basically, I'd assume that our big criticism here is we'd prefer to rank by economic strength. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but again, also several things. First, those relative priorities, why are they introduced? I mean, first, they start with that they notice that classical MRPs have a binary perspective on things, like am I okay or not okay? And they say, well, it's super crude, super crude. And the answer is yes, it's crude to the point that it's completely absurd. And again, back in the 50s, people in terms of numerical optimization were already doing things that were smarter than that. So yeah, very, very bad baseline. Okay, now the whole, now that we have introduced DDMRP style, first-class citizen, nodes called those decoupling points in your graph, you have an assumption that comes with that, which is stock is always available. So when this assumption is violated, obviously everything falls apart because you've built, your decoupled explosion are built on this assumption, your decoupled lead time are based on this assumption. So you need to basically get your supply chain system back on track with your core assumption. And basically the relative priorities says that you should basically act swiftly for the things that are diverging the most from your core assumption, which is like ongoing availability for those at those decoupling points. So it's good, indeed. That is something that makes sense, part of the recipe. But also, guess what? You are ending up with a prioritization which is partly incorrect. You know, I'm challenging the very motivation. The very motivation is to get the system back on track with respect of the assumption that you need to have DDMRP to work in the first place. So you see, it's a bit the snake eating its own tail. You introduce a methodology. This methodology comes with assumption, and your numerical calculation do not guarantee necessarily that those assumptions will be maintained during the course of the system. So you need to introduce tweaks so that you have some kind of, I would say, some feedback loop so that you can get back on track with respect of your own assumption. But that doesn't mean that we are back on track with something aligned with the end game of the business. And that's where my criticism is that, again, you are optimizing against percentage, ultimately, of, you want to have like percents of accuracy, percents of fulfillment, percents of buffer served, which are, again, optimization in percentage kind of bad. You want to have percentage in euros, and that connects the dots till the very end perspective, which is cost of stock, cost of wastage, cost of non-service. And on the other side, you have all the costs and the reward of serving clients on time. So that's where whatever you optimize. So I'm very much agree with the idea of prioritizing the decisions, but I very much disagree with the idea of prioritizing decisions so that you can loop back with your methodology. You need to prioritize the decisions so that you look back with the overall business goals expressed as economic drivers for the business as a whole. So what your supply chain is delivering as a whole.
Okay, let's start sort of drawing things together now. We've sort of described a lot of the flaws with DDMRP. So should we completely discount it as a technique?
It's interesting because I think we are going to make even more enemies from that. But you see, last week we were discussing about flow casting, and the thing with flow casting had some math that were dramatically incorrect, and so they were even degrading the situation compared to their baseline, which was kind of really bad. But some of the insight that had was profoundly true and would actually survive if we fix the math to make it work. It's very funny because DDMRP is kind of the opposite. It's basically something that works incrementally on top of a very, very bad baseline. If you step back and you say, well, instead of trying to duct tape something that is like very, very bad, if you directly start with good foundations, which is let's try to do numerical optimization the right way with proper algorithm, like proper probabilistic graph-based algorithms, then I'm not sure that once you've moved to a proper modern numerical framework to actually do an optimization, because that's the thing, is that classical MRPs, they are not really optimizing anything in a modern sense. Where you actually do an optimization, you will notice that what remains from DDMRP is literally nothing. It's very kind of bad and sad, but once you've removed, say, okay, you were doing all of that to basically duct tape profoundly dysfunctional numerical recipes. Now, if we remove the dysfunctional numerical recipes, what remains? And the answer is very, very little. And that's where, for example, flow casting was very different, because if you remove the dysfunctional parts, numerical parts of flow casting, the other insights that remain are profoundly interesting and I believe profoundly correct. DDMRP, much less so.
Okay, if we were going to finish on a more positive note, are there any insights that DDMRP gives us that are actually pretty good?
Yes, I believe one. It's basically moving average works, and it even works frequently better in the frequency domain as opposed to the time domain. Super esoteric, so let's go back into that. For those of you who have maybe learned at engineering school, you know about Fourier transform, you know you can study time series in the time domain or in the frequency domain. That's something that is done very frequently in acoustics and whatnot. And usually when people think about forecasting the demand, frequently, you know, the moving average can work when you have demand that is stationary. And typically when people think of moving average forecasts, they are thinking of doing an analysis in the time domain. So what does that mean? I'm averaging demand over the, say, last 3 weeks. So a fixed period, that's my time domain. The frequency domain is to think, instead of averaging over the last 3 weeks, and 3 weeks is like fixed, I say I'm going to average my demand over the last 100 units served. Good news is that this thing of the last 100 units, that will behave much more, you know, in a way, numerically speaking, that is much more well behaved with respect of demand that is kind of super erratic and spiky and whatnot. So moving average in the frequency domain is actually interesting. And by the way, DDMRP, with those buffers, they are actually forecast, moving average forecast, done in the frequency domain instead of being done in the time domain. And basically, they have kind of rediscovered, but it's a very good insight, and indeed it is very valuable, that analyzing things in the frequency domain do works and have like profound implication for the supply chain, and is a very interesting angle to optimize. So I think that's the angle. I'm not sure if people from DDMRP see it like this, but I believe that's a very cool and very good insights that came from the DDMRP practices.
Okay, hopefully you've gone some way to repairing a few of those relationships anyway. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in. If you agree or disagree, make sure you leave us a comment, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.